So I'm a social scientist, and I've specialized all my academic life on peace studies. That is a branch of social studies where we deal with reducing violence exactly as a doctor reduces diseases if he or she can, and then disseminating this through research, public outreach, and activities on the ground. I worked in a lot of war zones and tried to heal wounds after wars. Let's say since the last 5 to 10 years. If I give you an example, I think it's now 5 years ago that the Congress passed a law, and listen carefully, a law which set off $1,500 million, $1.5 billion, over 5 years to train Western journalists in writing negative stories about China. That's done by the state agency of media in the United States. They need desperately to have enemies. And if you don't have enemies, and I don't see anything in China's foreign policy that is a threat to the United States. It is not China that has its vessels outside California's coast or Florida's coast. It is the West that has all its vessels around China. And the AUKUS cooperation with Australia, and the submarines that are there around you too, and the Taiwan issue. I don't see China do these things to the West. Imagine, it's not completely comparable, but imagine that China was obsessed with arming Hawaii to become an independent state. I wonder how Washington would react to something like that. And therefore you invent your enemies. If you want enemies, it's easy to make it. You now have Russia. You have a large part of the African world, the global south, and you have China. That you declare, don't follow us, are different from us, think differently, and therefore they are our enemies. This is very, very dangerous and very, very sad, because we could gain so much from working together. And I can still only hope that there will be somebody who comes to their senses, and it will not be Biden, and it will not be Trump, and change America from the inside. Because the moment America, with all its resources, creativity and ideas and history and knowledge, begin to become a partner in the world, not somebody who insists on dominating over everybody else, the world will be a much better place, and the United States will be a much better place. So I'm looking for a peaceful revolution where the Americans will rise and say, enough is enough with your empire and militarism. We want a good society here, and we want to be friends with the world. The only candidate who is saying that at the moment is Robert Kennedy Jr., Robert F. Kennedy Jr. But it remains to be seen whether he will have a chance to become a president. I doubt it, but we'll see. The idea that we are supposed as number one world, you remember it was one called the first world, the second world, the third world, and the fourth world, that by the first one there's this idea that we shall all move up to become like the West, Europe and the United States. And that idea, of course, is everywhere, whether in colonialist times in Africa or elsewhere, the liberation movements in the 60s, they said, we don't want to have your system, whether it's Christianity or it's your way of thinking of human rights or whatever. This be like us is over. Now, instead of then reaching out and say, okay, our time is over, we will be one among many and we will cooperate with you, what they do is they insist on one thing, and that is to dominate by means of deception, untruths, narratives, and secondly, militarism. I would like to predict at this occasion, the United States will go the same way as the Soviet Union, because it is militarizing itself to death. The Americans don't do diplomacy anymore, they send weapons. They pour in weapons because that's what they are best at. But no country can survive with just being strong in one sense, for instance, militarily. If you become politically weak, you become economically weak, you become psychologically weak, you become weak in terms of international law and legitimacy, then you are on your way down. A strong country is one which has high level on all power indicators and do not over-militarize and neglect the other power scales. The United States has, you can say, a MIMAC. MIMAC, Military Industrial Media Academic Complex. These are elites who have common interests with each other. such as producing weapons, selling weapons, using weapons, destroying countries, rebuilding countries again. But they do not have any common interest with the people in their countries. They're outside democratic control, and who said that? President Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1961 or 2 or whenever he made his farewell speech. It's a very famous speech by a man who was a general himself, who said the United States has developed a military-industrial complex. He didn't call it MIMAC as I do. And we need to put it under control to remain a democracy. What is undermined very, very clearly now is pluralist open media and our democracy in the West, because everything is now geared to warfare and militarism. More, more, more. There's nobody who stops to think. There's nobody who stops to think about the long-term consequences of pouring in weapons and never solving the conflicts. You just look at what goes on now in Israel. The country that has so much weaponry already, had nuclear weapons, have had a special agreement with weapons with the United States, $5 billion a year, I don't know for how many years. What is the first reaction in Washington? We must transfer even more weapons to Israel. This is a sick society. It's a sick way of thinking. And of course, this whole thing has to do with, as I said before, the dream, the unrealistic dream or illusion that if we can get rid of Russia as an opponent, and we have created that opponent ourselves because they never invaded a NATO country, they hope that they can concentrate all NATO's resources on a Cold War or, God forbid, a hot war against China. You just go to NATO's homepage and you look at the threat perception. There's never an argument on NATO's homepage. The text is, China is a threat or a challenge because China is different from us. China has different interests from us in the West. Now, if that's how you define a threat, everybody around the world basically is a threat. So the whole thing is a military-industrial complex lives from finding enemies, because if you don't have enemies, or say you have enemies, or appoint somebody, or make enemies, you can't legitimate your own arms development, and the military-industrial media academic complex will fall apart. So that's why the moment we get rid of that military-industrial media academic complex, we can begin to talk to each other as human beings. So the long story short here, I think, is that I wouldn't trust that the Americans are going to change much unless there is a people's revolution, a non-violent, not the stupid thing that we saw on 6th of January 2 years ago, but if there is an uprising in the United States saying, no more militarism, we want a good society here, and we want cooperation with China and everybody else in the world. We need to cooperate to solve humanity's environmental problems, poverty problems, infrastructure problems, all these things. We're wasting every hour for humanity's and our children's future by militarism and warfare. Well, there can't be peace in the world without the two biggest countries and economies working together. I think it's possible. We still have this possibility of rising from below in the Western world and say enough is enough. I'm looking for democracy to work that way. I'm not looking for Biden or Trump. I don't think they will change the system. We need a system change in the West. That the United States will come to its senses and begin to see itself as one partner of the world and not a dominator, an imperialist and militarist.
You're my strongest inspiration.